In 2022, a team of population geneticists published a study that quietly sent shockwaves through the scientific community. They had collected DNA samples from over 15,000 individuals spanning the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, North Africa, and the Iranian plateau. They compared haplogroup frequencies, ran admixture models, and calculated genetic distance scores between every major Arab and Persian population on record. The results came back, and when they mapped the data, one finding stood out so sharply that the researchers ran the analysis 3 more times just to confirm it. What they found contradicts everything two civilizations have spent centuries telling themselves about who they are. If you are watching this, hit subscribe. Next week, I am breaking down the ancient DNA evidence that suggests a ghost population once lived across the Middle East that has no living descendants anyone can identify. That video goes up in 7 days. But this one is about something just as strange. This is about 2 groups of people who have defined themselves in opposition to each other for over 1,400 years. Arabs and Persians. Different languages, different ethnic identities, different origin stories, and the DNA is about to complicate all of it in ways nobody saw coming. To understand why the findings matter, you need to understand what scientists were actually measuring. DNA does not care about nationality. It does not care about religion or language or which empire your ancestors served. It carries haplogroups, which are clusters of genetic mutations passed down through specific lineages. Y chromosome haplogroups trace the paternal line. Mitochondrial haplogroups trace the maternal line. When 2 populations share a haplogroup at high frequency, it means they share a common ancestor at some point in the past. The question is always how far back that ancestor lived. And that is where it gets complicated. Because sharing a haplogroup does not mean 2 populations are the same. It means they were once connected. What happened in between is the story. The researchers also used something called admixture analysis. This takes a person's full genome and breaks it down into ancestry components from different ancient source populations. Think of it like a recipe. Your DNA might be 40% from one ancient group, 35% from another, and 25% from a third. By modeling thousands of individuals this way, scientists can see the invisible migrations that shaped modern populations. And in the Middle East, those invisible migrations go back much further than the Arab conquests or the Persian Empire. They go back to people who have no name in any history book. The study started by establishing a baseline. What does Arab DNA actually look like? And here's the first problem. There is no single Arab DNA. The word Arab describes a linguistic and cultural identity, not a genetic one. And when you sequence actual Arab populations, what you find is remarkable internal diversity. Levantine Arabs, the populations of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, clustered genetically with ancient farming populations from the Fertile Crescent. They carry haplogroup J2 at rates between 25 and 30%. They carry haplogroup E1b1b at around 15 to 20%, a marker that traces back to North African and East African populations who moved into the Levant thousands of years ago. And they carry J1 at around 20%. Gulf Arabs are different. Populations from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar show haplogroup J1 at frequencies between 40 and 60%. This is the haplogroup most strongly associated with the ancient Semitic-speaking populations of the Arabian Peninsula. It is the marker of the pre-Islamic Bedouin tribes, the people who gave the world the Arabic language and, eventually, Islam. When most people picture Arab DNA, this is what they are picturing. But even among Gulf Arabs, the picture is not clean. There is a component in their genome that points somewhere else entirely, and that component is what the study was really about. Yemeni Arabs are different again. They show some of the oldest genetic signatures on the Arabian Peninsula, including haplogroup J1 variants that split off earlier than the branches found in the Gulf. They also carry more East African admixture than any other Arab population, reflecting thousands of years of maritime contact across the Red Sea. Haplogroup E1b1b appears in Yemeni populations at rates around 25%, higher than anywhere else on the peninsula. North African Arabs, particularly Egyptians and Moroccans, carry the heaviest North African and Berber admixture. Haplogroup E1b1b dominates in some communities. And Iraqi Arabs sit somewhere in between, carrying Mesopotamian ancestry components that predate both the Arab and Persian civilizations by thousands of years. So Arab DNA is not one thing. It is a spectrum running from the ancient Levantine farmers in the north to the ancient peninsula tribes in the south, with different admixture patterns depending on geography, trade, and history. And the same is true on the Persian side. But here is where it starts to get strange. The study then turned to Iranian populations. Modern Persians, concentrated in the central and northwestern plateau of Iran, carry a genetic profile that reflects something very old. Haplogroup J2 appears at around 20 to 25%, similar to Levantine Arabs. Haplogroup R1A, the steppe marker carried by the Indo-Iranian migrations that swept into the plateau around 4,000 years ago, appears at around 15 to 20%. This is the genetic fingerprint of the ancient Aryan migrations, the same population movements that gave Persians their Indo-European language. It is completely absent in Arab populations at any significant frequency. Kurds carry even higher R1 of frequencies, sometimes exceeding 25%. They are genetically distinct from Persians despite sharing geography and historical overlap. Azeris, in northwestern Iran, show significant Turkic admixture from Central Asian migrations over the past 1,000 years. Baloch populations in southeastern Iran carry different patterns again, including South Asian admixture from populations connected to the ancient Indus Valley. Iran is not genetically homogeneous. Like the Arab world, it is a mosaic. But here is the problem with that mosaic. When you run the admixture models and compare Persian populations to Gulf Arab populations at the genome-wide level, something unexpected appears. The genetic distance between core Persian populations and Gulf Arab populations is smaller than the genetic distance between Gulf Arab populations and Yemeni Arab populations. Two groups of people who both call themselves Arab are more genetically distant from each other than one of them is from the Persians they have historically defined themselves against. And that finding is just the beginning. To understand why this happened, you need to go back further than anyone expected. Before there were Arabs, before there were Persians, before there were languages or empires or religions, there was a population that geneticists call the Natufians. The Natufians lived in the Levant between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. They were pre-agricultural, semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers who were among the first people anywhere on Earth to stop moving and start staying in one place. They built the earliest known villages. They harvested wild grain without yet domesticating it. And their DNA shows up in both modern Arab and modern Persian populations at a level that nobody fully anticipated. The Natufian ancestry component appears in Levantine Arab populations at around 50 to 60%. It appears in Gulf Arab populations at around 30 to 40%, diluted by later Arabian Peninsula populations who carried less of it, and it appears in modern Persian populations at around 25 to 35%. So, both Arabs and Persians carry the genetic legacy of the same ancient farming population that first settled the Fertile Crescent. That ancestry spread east into the Iranian plateau as early farmers expanded their territory. It spread south into the Arabian Peninsula more gradually, mixing with populations already living there. It is the deepest shared root between these two groups, and it is invisible to both of them. Nobody in Tehran or Riyadh thinks of themselves as a descendant of Natufian foragers, but genetically, both populations carry that signature. Then there is the other ghost, the ancient North Eurasians. Ancient North Eurasians, abbreviated ANE, were a population that lived across northern Eurasia during the last ice age. They are known almost entirely from ancient DNA because they left very few modern descendants directly, but their genetic signal shows up across enormous geographic distances. It entered the Middle East through the steppe migrations that brought Indo-European languages into Iran. It shows up in Persian populations through the haplogroup R1A lineage and through the genome-wide ANE ancestry component that sits at around 10 to 15% in modern Persians. It shows up in Arab populations at much lower levels, around 3 to 5%, mostly through historical contact with Iranian and steppe populations along the northern borders of the Arabian Peninsula. That difference is actually important. The gap in ANE ancestry between Persians and Arabs is one of the clearest genetic signals of the steppe migrations. The Aryans, who arrived on the Iranian plateau around 4,000 years ago, brought this ancestry with them. They mixed with the existing Chalcolithic farming populations and created the genetic profile that would eventually become Persian. Arab populations, developing further south on the peninsula, were largely shielded from those migrations by geography. The result is a clear and measurable genetic difference between the two groups on this specific ancestry component. And yet, the overall genetic distance is still smaller than most people would expect, given the cultural, linguistic, and political narrative. And the reason comes down to one migration that nobody disputes but everyone underestimates: the Neolithic, the spread of farming. Around 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, farming populations from the Fertile Crescent expanded outward in every direction, north into Europe, east into Central Asia, and eventually the Iranian plateau, south into the Arabian Peninsula. These were not armies. They were families following rainfall and fertile soil. But they changed the genetic landscape of the entire region, and they left a shared ancestry signal that persists to this day in both Arab and Persian populations. That shared Neolithic farming ancestry is the invisible thread connecting two civilizations that have spent centuries insisting they are fundamentally different. But the story of the Arab conquests is where things get genuinely strange, and it is where the data produces its most counterintuitive finding. In 636 CE, Arab armies defeated the Sassanid Persian Empire at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. Within a decade, one of the greatest empires in the ancient world had collapsed. Persia was absorbed into the emerging Islamic Caliphate. Arabic became the language of religion and governance. Persian elites converted to Islam. The expectation, if you read political history, is that this conquest should have left a massive genetic signal: hundreds of thousands of Arab soldiers and settlers moving into a conquered territory. It should look, genetically, like a population replacement. It does not. The genetic data is clear on this. Modern Persian populations carry Arab admixture at levels between 3 and 8%. That is it. One of the most consequential conquests in human history, a military and cultural transformation that changed the religion, the script, and the political identity of an entire civilization, left almost no genetic trace. The Persian genome survived the Arab conquest almost entirely intact. Why? The answer involves scale and direction. The Arab armies that conquered Persia were not settlers. They were soldiers. The caliphate needed administrators, tax collectors, and local elites to govern the vast territory it had acquired. Persian bureaucrats, scholars, and landowners were too useful to displace. They converted. They adopted Arabic script. They became Muslim, but they did not leave. And the Arab soldiers who did settle in conquered territories concentrated in garrison cities, places like Basra and Kufa in what is now Iraq, not in the Persian heartland further east. The genetic mixing that did occur happened at the edges, in the border zones and trading cities, not in the interior of the plateau. The result is a Persian population that is genetically almost identical to its pre-Islamic ancestors. Researchers compared ancient DNA from Sassanid era burial sites to modern Persian populations and found continuity at levels above 90%. The culture changed, the religion changed, the script changed. The genes did not. This raises an obvious question. If the Arab conquest barely touched Persian DNA, what does that mean for the genetic overlap between Gulf Arabs and Persians? How did two populations end up genetically closer to each other than either expected? The answer is not the conquest. The answer is what came before it. For thousands of years, before the Arab armies arrived in Persia, there was commerce. The Persian Gulf is not a barrier, it is a highway. Arabian merchants traded with Persian ports. Persian administrators governed Arab tribal territories in the northeastern peninsula. Populations moved across the water in both directions. Fisher communities intermarried. Slave trade brought East African ancestry into both populations through the same networks. The genetic mixing between Gulf Arabs and Persians was not a product of conquest. It was a product of proximity, commerce, and centuries of quiet, undramatic contact that never made it into any history book. When researchers broke down the data by region, the gradient became visible. Gulf Arabs from Bahrain and Qatar, the populations living closest to the Iranian coast, showed the highest levels of Iranian genetic admixture of any Arab population, between 10 and 15%. Gulf Arabs from the interior of Saudi Arabia showed less, around 5 to 8%. Levantine Arabs in Syria and Lebanon showed almost none, less than 2%. The admixture tracks geography almost perfectly. The closer to Iran, the more Iranian DNA. Not because of conquest, because of proximity. And on the Iranian side, the gradient runs the same way in reverse. Populations in Khuzestan province, in southwestern Iran, right on the border with the Arab world, show Arab admixture at around 15 to 20%. Iranian populations in the central plateau show 3 to 5%. Iranian populations in the far northeast show almost none. The political border between the Arab world and Iran is one of the most symbolically charged lines in the modern Middle East, but genetically, it is a gradient, a slow fade, not a wall. Now, here is the finding that nobody saw coming, the one that made the researchers run their analysis again. When the team plotted genome-wide genetic distances between all the populations in their dataset, they produced a cluster map. Related populations cluster together. Distant populations sit far apart. The Arab populations did not form a single cluster. They split. Levantine Arabs clustered with ancient Anatolian and Caucasian populations. North African Arabs clustered with Berber and East African populations. Yemeni Arabs clustered with South Arabian and East African populations. And Gulf Arabs clustered closer to Iranians than to Yemenis. The genetic distance between a man from Kuwait and a man from Tehran is smaller than the genetic distance between a man from Kuwait and a man from Sana'a. Both the Kuwaiti and the Yemeni call themselves Arab. Both speak Arabic. Both are Muslim. But at the level of their genome, the Kuwaiti is more closely related to the Persian. That is not a political statement. That is a measurement. The reason is ancient and geographic. Yemen sits at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, partially isolated by the Rub al-Khali Desert that makes large-scale migration in or out difficult. Yemeni populations carry some of the oldest lineages on the peninsula, genetic signatures that have been relatively stable for thousands of years. Gulf populations, by contrast, sit at the interface between the peninsula and the rest of the ancient world. They were always the trading edge, and that trading edge left a genetic signature. But the implications of this go far beyond a cluster map, because what the data is really showing is that the concept of Arab genetic identity is not a single thing. It never was. The Arabic language spread further and faster than the genes of the people who originally spoke it. When Arab armies and merchants and missionaries spread across the Middle East and North Africa, they spread a language and a religion. They did not replace populations. They converted them. The Egyptians who speak Arabic today are genetically descended from ancient Egyptians. The Moroccans who speak Arabic are genetically descended from ancient Berbers. The Iraqis who speak Arabic are genetically descended from ancient Mesopotamians. Arabic identity is cultural. It is linguistic. It is not primarily genetic. And the same is true, to a somewhat lesser degree, of Persian identity. The Kurds of Iran speak an Indo-European language related to Persian, but they cluster genetically distinct from Persians on the cluster map, sitting between Persian and Caucasian populations. The Azeris of northwestern Iran speak a Turkic language and carry significant Central Asian admixture from medieval Turkic migrations. The Baloch of southeastern Iran carry South Asian genetic components. Iranian identity, as a political and cultural category, spans several genetically distinct populations. So the study ended up demonstrating something that makes both groups uncomfortable. Arab identity is not primarily genetic. Persian identity is not a monolith. And the two groups share far more ancient ancestry than the past 1,400 years of history would suggest. The stability of the Persian genetic signal through the Arab conquest also tells us something important about how civilizations actually absorb shocks. Compare it to what happened in Arabia itself. The pre-Islamic Arab tribes of the peninsula underwent significant genetic change in the centuries following the Islamic expansion. As conquered peoples converted and integrated into the Islamic world, some reverse migration occurred. Non-Arab Muslims settled in Arabian cities. Slave populations from East Africa and Central Asia were absorbed into Arab families over generations. The Arabian Peninsula is actually more genetically mixed today than it was in the pre-Islamic period. The conquerors absorbed more outside DNA than the people they conquered. That is not what the narrative says. The narrative says the Arabs swept out of the desert and transformed the world, and they did. Culturally, linguistically, and religiously, the Arab expansion is one of the most significant events in human history. But genetically, the world transformed the Arabs at least as much as the Arabs transformed the world. Geography shaped everything here, as it always does. The Iranian plateau has natural protection from the south and west in the form of mountain ranges and desert corridors that funnel migration into narrow passages. Large-scale population movement into the interior of Iran was never easy. This is why the Arab conquests of Persia relied on the existing Persian administrative class. Moving hundreds of thousands of settlers across that terrain was simply not logistically viable. The mountains that protected the Achaemenid and Sassanid empires militarily also protected the genetic continuity of their populations after conquest. The Arabian Peninsula, by contrast, is porous on its northern and eastern edges. The Gulf Coast, the Levant border, the Mesopotamian lowlands, all of these were zones of persistent contact and mixing. Gulf Arab populations sat at the intersection of Indian Ocean trade routes, Persian Gulf commerce, and overland caravan networks. They were always absorbing outside genetic input. That is why they end up genetically closer to Iranians than to Yemenis. Not because of any single event, but because of 1,000 years of daily contact. The study also looked at something that almost no one discusses publicly: the genetic legacy of the slave trade. For centuries, the Persian Gulf was a hub of Indian Ocean slave networks. Enslaved East Africans were brought to both Arabian and Persian ports. They were absorbed into households, military units, and eventually the general population. The genetic signal of this is detectable. East African admixture, traced through specific mitochondrial haplogroups and through genome-wide ancestry components, appears in Gulf Arab populations at around 8 to 12%, and in coastal Iranian populations at around 5 to 8%. It is higher on the Arabian side, reflecting the scale of that trade and its longer duration in the Gulf. That ancestry is almost never discussed in public discourse about identity in the Gulf, but it is there, in the DNA of people who would not describe themselves as having African ancestry. The genome records what the history books omit. And now the question that the data opens up but cannot answer: if Arab and Persian populations are more genetically similar than their identities suggest, why have those identities remained so sharp? The answer is probably that genetic similarity was never the real foundation of either identity. Arab identity was built around language, tribal genealogy, and later Islam. Persian identity was built around an imperial tradition, a literary heritage, and a specific relationship to the pre-Islamic past that survived conversion. Both identities are cultural constructions that draw on real historical experiences. Neither one requires genetic exclusivity to be meaningful. But the data creates a problem for a specific kind of nationalist narrative, the narrative that says these two groups are fundamentally, biologically different, that Arab and Persian are opposite categories rooted in nature, not history, The genome does not support that. It shows two populations that share Natufian ancestry, share Neolithic farming ancestry, share thousands of years of Gulf commerce and daily contact, and diverged primarily because of a steppe migration into the Iranian plateau 4,000 years ago that left a detectable but not dominant signal. The political hostility between the Arab world and Iran, between Sunni and Shia political blocs, between the Arab League and the Islamic Republic is real and consequential. But it is political. It is historical. It is religious. It is not written in the genome. The genome shows something far older than any of those divisions. It shows a shared deep past that neither civilization has fully reckoned with. Here is what that means for the people alive today. There are approximately 450 million Arabs spread across 22 countries and approximately 85 million Iranians. Many of them carry narratives of fundamental difference: Arab versus Persian, Semite versus Aryan, desert nomad versus plateau civilization. Those narratives have political functions. They mobilize populations. They justify conflicts. They create boundaries that powerful people find useful. But the DNA of a Gulf Arab and the DNA of a Persian from Isfahan are carrying the same Natufian ghost, the same ancient farmer who built the first villages in the Levant 12,000 years ago, the same signal of the population that made agriculture possible. They are separated by 4,000 years of steppe migration, 1,400 years of religious and political divergence, and centuries of conflict. But underneath all of that, the genome records a connection that goes back to the very beginning of settled human civilization in the region. That is the thing about DNA. It does not take sides, it just keeps the record. And that record raises a question that I do not think genetics can fully answer. If two populations share this much ancient ancestry, and if the cultural and political differences between them are primarily historical rather than biological, then what are those differences actually about? What is it that makes an identity so powerful that it survives for centuries even when the genome underneath it tells a more complicated story? That question does not have a genetic answer. It is a question about human beings and the stories we need to tell about ourselves. And it is one of the most important questions in the modern Middle East right now. If you made it this far, subscribe. Next week, I am going into the ancient DNA evidence from the Rub al-Khali Desert, the empty quarter, where researchers have found traces of a population that lived in Arabia when it was green, before the desertification, before the tribes, before any of the civilizations we know by name, a population that may be the true genetic foundation of the entire Arabian Peninsula. And the results of that analysis are going to change how you think about every civilization we just discussed. That video is already in production. I will see you there.